At St John's, we would usually have a reading of the Passion Gospel presented for us by members of the congregation. Unfortunately, we can't do that this year, and I know some of you will be missing that. So I do have a book written by Trevor Dennis. It's called The Book of Books, and it's subtitled The Bible Retold. And he retells the Bible as a novel. And I'm going to read the Passion story from that for you. It is quite long, so you might want to go and make yourself a cup of tea, come back, make yourself comfortable while we listen to the story of Jesus. The chief priests and scribes were determined to stop Jesus, but how? That was the problem. They didn't expect to get any help from Jesus' followers, of course, but that's precisely what they were given, and from one of his closest friends too. One of the men who'd been with him up in Galilee all the time he was teaching and healing people there, someone called Judas Iscariot. Judas slipped away from Bethany when he thought no one was looking, went into Jerusalem, found his way to the chief priests, and told them he would hand Jesus over to them. "I can tell you exactly what he's been saying about the temple," he said, "and I know his movements. Tonight I'll lead you to him. I know where he and his friends will be. It'll be an out-of-the-way place, no crowds, no fuss, no risk of a riot. I'll go up to him and give him a kiss of greeting. Then you'll know which one he is, and you can arrest him." "Excellent, excellent," the priests cried. "This is just the chance we've been looking for." "We're very grateful to you, Judas. Don't worry, you're doing the right thing, and you'll be nicely rewarded for your trouble." Judas left and hurried back to Bethany to join the others. As part of the Passover celebrations, Jesus and a group of his friends were going to have a special meal together. They would commemorate the time when the Israelites escaped from Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and entered the desert to meet God on Sinai. At least that's what the friends thought the meal would be about. Jesus had other ideas. In fact, the friends were in for quite a few surprises that evening. "We need to find somewhere for our Passover meal and get everything ready," his friends said to Jesus. "Where do you want us to go?" Jesus chose two of them and gave them their instructions. "Go into Jerusalem," he said, "and a man will meet you. He'll be carrying a water jar on his head. Usually the women do that, as you know, and the men who sell water in the street use leather bottles, so you'll pick him out quite easily. He'll lead you to a house he knows. When you get there, say to the owner, 'The teacher asks, where is the room where I may eat the Passover with my friends?' He'll show you a large upstairs room with everything you need already there. Then you'll be able to get the meal ready for us." The two friends went off and they found things exactly as he'd said. When evening came, Jesus arrived at the house with the rest of his friends. While they were eating, they noticed Jesus was very quiet. He seemed preoccupied, thinking of something else. Suddenly he said, "One of you in this room is going to betray me." The friends were shocked. "Not me, not me, not me," they cried. "It's one of you who is eating with me at this very moment," Jesus said. "Teacher," said Judas, "surely you don't mean me?" Jesus looked across at him. A little later in the meal, Jesus took a loaf of bread, said a prayer of blessing over it, broke it, handed the pieces to his friends and said, "Take, eat. This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then he took a cup of wine, said a prayer of thanks and handed it round. "This is my blood," he said, "poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." He paused and then added, "My body and blood will mark a new beginning, a new friendship with God, a new finding of forgiveness. I tell you, I will not drink wine again until I drink it at a great feast with God, once everyone allows God to reign and all things at last are well." The friends didn't know what to make of these strange, wonderful words. They were not what they expected in a Passover meal at all, but they would never forget them. That same evening, they had another surprise. Jesus got up, laid aside his outer robe, tied a towel around his waist, poured water into a pitcher, and began to wash the dust off their feet and dry them with the towel. He came to Peter. "Master, are you going to wash my feet?" Peter asked. "You will understand one day," Jesus answered. "But you can't," Peter cried. "I mean, it's work for a slave to do. Even slaves, if they're Jewish, can't be told to do it. But you're not a slave. You're our master, our Lord, our teacher. We could wash your feet to show how much you mean to us, but you can't wash ours. You've got it all back to front." "I understand all that," Jesus said. "But if I don't wash your feet, how can I show you how much I love you? And how can you be my friend, Peter, if you won't let me near you?" "In that case, wash my hands and face as well," Peter exclaimed. Jesus laughed. "Your feet are enough," he said. He straightened up and looked around at the rest of his friends. "Do you understand what I have done?" he asked. "You call me teacher, master, Lord, and yet I have washed your feet. I have acted as your disciple, your slave. With me, things are back to front, you see, the same as they are with God. You must all follow my example. You know how kings often lord it over their subjects. They look down on people and keep them under their thumb or their boot, while making sure everyone says how kind and generous they are. You must not be like them. The oldest among you must be like the youngest. Your leader must be like your servant. Just look at me with this wet towel around my waist. Do I look like a king? Yet I will be your teacher once more and give you something you must remember. It is very simple. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you also must love one another." The Passover meal was over. Judas had already slipped out. Jesus and his friends sang a psalm together, a special psalm for the Passover, and then went out through the city walls and down into the Kidron Valley the other side. They were beginning to climb the slopes of the Mount of Olives towards the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus said to his friends, "You will all desert me." "I won't," protested Peter. "Even if everyone else does, I won't." "Then, Peter," Jesus replied, "this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Even if I have to die with you, I swear I will not deny you," said Peter, and the others all said the same. So they came to Gethsemane. It was dark. There was no moonlight, no stars shining either. "Sit here," Jesus said, "while I pray. Peter, James, and John, you come with me." The 4 of them went further into the garden among the twisted olive trees. As soon as they were hidden from the others, Jesus became very agitated. "My heart is ready to break with fear," he said. "Stay here and keep awake." He went on a bit further on his own. He fell to the ground and prayed to God. "Abba, my Father," he said, "you can do anything. I don't want to go through with this. Do something to get me out of it." He was shaking violently. He buried his forehead in the dust. "Yet not what I want, but what you want," he said. He got to his feet, still shaking, and went back to Peter, James, and John. They were fast asleep. "Peter," he said, "couldn't you keep awake just 1 hour? Wake up, stay awake and pray. Pray that you will not be tested in this way yourselves." He returned to the same spot as before. He prayed the same words. He waited for God to speak to him. Silence. Only the wind gently ruffling the leaves of the trees. Once again he came back to the 3 friends. He desperately needed their comfort, their strength, their support, but they were asleep again. He stood there looking down at them. They woke up with a start and didn't know what to say. He turned and went a 3rd time to pray, to find God's company, to bring God close. But when he listened for God, he still only heard the wind in the trees. The 3rd time he came back to his friends. For the 3rd time he found them sleeping. "Still asleep," he said quietly, "still taking it easy. He turned his head and listened. There was a new sound. They were coming to get him. He could see the flickering lights of torches through the trees. "Get up," he shouted to his friends. "They're here." The friends were still stumbling to their feet when Judas arrived, leading a band of soldiers from the temple guard, armed with swords and wooden clubs. Judas marched straight up to Jesus. "Teacher," he cried, and kissed him. The soldiers arrested Jesus immediately. Jesus looked at the weapons they were holding. "So you think I'm a dangerous bandit, do you?" he said. "Why didn't you arrest me when I was in the temple?" His friends were terrified. They could get arrested themselves if they stayed with Jesus, or even worse, they could get killed. So they deserted him and ran off as fast as they could. All except Peter. He ran out of the garden, but then hid behind some trees to watch what happened. Jesus was left on his own with Judas and the soldiers. The flames of the torches cast strange shadows among the trees. The moon and the stars were still hidden behind thick cloud. The soldiers started to march Jesus away. The soldiers led Jesus back into the city through the gate in the walls, along the narrow, winding streets. It was very late, and the streets were deserted. The sound of their feet echoed against the walls of the houses. They took him to the house of the high priest, where the chief priests, scribes, and elders were already gathered. They were expecting him. This was the Sanhedrin, the highest Jewish court in the land. Peter had been following the soldiers at a distance. After they'd disappeared indoors, he crept into the courtyard of the house. He couldn't go any further. He would have to wait. It was a cold night, but fortunately there was a fire burning in a brazier. He crouched down close to it and spread his hands to the flames. There was no one else about. In a large room upstairs, the Sanhedrin put Jesus on trial. They were breaking their own rules by meeting like this at night, but that didn't matter to them. Justice didn't matter either. They just wanted to get rid of Jesus. The man was too much of a risk. He had challenged the whole operation of the temple. That couldn't be tolerated. They realized that Pilate, the Roman governor, would want Jesus dead as much as they did, though for a different reason. His soldiers would have heard people hailing Jesus as a king. Surely he would see Jesus as a direct threat to his authority and the authority of the emperor in Rome. They would hand Jesus over to Pilate in the morning. They'd need to get the crowds on their side as well. That shouldn't be too difficult, they thought, at least as far as the people who lived in Jerusalem were concerned. Most of them depended on the temple for their livelihood, and Jesus was threatening to bring the temple to an end. As for the others, including the peasants from places like Galilee, Pilate would think of something. The trial was rigged. The priests had bribed some people to give evidence against Jesus, but some people said one thing, some another. Their evidence didn't agree. The high priest became impatient. Time was getting on, and they needed a proper case to put to Pilate, or they'd look stupid. Jesus wasn't helping matters either, as far as the high priest was concerned. He hadn't said a word. They'd been giving him a chance to answer the charges, but he kept silent for the whole time, with his eyes fixed on the floor. "Have you nothing to say?" the high priest asked. "What about all these things they're saying against you?" Jesus said nothing. The high priest lost his temper. "Look at you," he shouted. "You're the Messiah, the Son of God, are you?" He laughed. Jesus raised his head and looked across at him. "I am," he said quietly. "And when I die, you will see the Son of God seated at God's right hand, coming with the clouds of heaven to defeat the forces of tyranny and put an end to the misery you cause. You think you have me in your power, but look more deeply. And when I die, look into the depths of God, and you will find me there." "This is blasphemy," cried the high priest. He tore his clothes to mark the end of the trial and to show that the prisoner was a blasphemer. He looked around at the other members of the Sanhedrin. "We don't need any more witnesses," he said. "You've heard his blasphemy from your own lips. What sentence do you pass?" There was only one sentence they could pass. Anyone convicted of blasphemy had to be put to death. "The man deserves to die," they cried. They gathered round Jesus. Some of them spat in his face. One person fastened a blindfold around his head, and they started to hit him. "Come on, prophet," they yelled. "Let's have some prophecy." Then the temple guards took over and gave him a beating. While all this was going on, Peter was down below in the courtyard, still warming himself near the fire. It was nearly dawn. A few people were up already and going about their duties. One of the high priest's servant girls came past and noticed Peter crouching there. The flames from the fire lit up his face. She stopped for a moment. "What's that man doing there?" she said to herself. She stared at him a bit harder. "Wait a minute. I think I recognize him. I was up in the temple the other day when that Jesus caused all the trouble. This man was with him, I'm sure of it." "You were with Jesus, weren't you?" she said out loud. "That man from Nazareth who's been causing all the trouble." "I don't know what you're talking about," Peter said. He got up and went into the passage leading from the courtyard to the street. It was darker there, a better place to hide perhaps. In the next street, a cock crowed. Time passed. There were quite a few people around now. The same servant girl came past the end of the passage. She saw Peter hiding there. "Hey," she called out. "This man's one of Jesus' friends. I recognize him." Everyone stopped and stared at him. "I am not," Peter cried. His heart was thumping. They all gathered round him. "Yes, you are," they exclaimed. "We can tell from your accent. You're from Galilee. You must be one of his friends." Peter was frightened now. "I solemnly swear by God, the Lord of heaven and earth, I do not know the man you're talking about." At that moment, the cock crowed for the second time. Peter remembered what Jesus had said as they were on their way to Gethsemane. "This very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. He broke down and wept. The morning had arrived. It was time to send Jesus to Pilate. So the priests tied Jesus' hands together and led him through the streets to the palace where Pilate was staying during the festival. Pilate was delighted that they'd managed to arrest Jesus without causing any disturbance in the city. He knew why they'd been so keen to get their hands on the man, but he didn't worry about any of that. All he was interested in was the report he'd received from his own troops that the Galilean was going round calling himself a king, and that he had a large crowd of followers who believed he was. Apparently some children had been shouting, "God bless the king," inside the precincts of the temple. Clearly he had to get rid of the man, or he'd have a major riot on his hands, and the emperor back in Rome wouldn't be pleased at all. The emperor didn't like riots. Jesus was led into his presence. Pilate looked him up and down. His hands were tied and his face was bruised and swollen with the beating he'd had from the temple guards. He could see people had been spitting on him. "So," he said with a sneer in his voice, "you are this king I've been hearing about, are you?" "So you say," said Jesus. The chief priests leapt in at once with their accusations. Pilate expected Jesus to defend himself, but he didn't. He seemed to know the game they were playing and was have nothing to do with it. "Have you nothing to say?" Pilate asked angrily. "Look at all the charges they're bringing against you." Jesus remained silent. Pilate was astonished. In his experience, Jewish troublemakers usually had a great deal to say for themselves, but this man clearly wasn't frightened. "Well, we'll have to see what the crowd thinks, won't we?" he said. They were in an upstairs room overlooking a large courtyard at the front of the palace. The courtyard was seething with people. Pilate looked down on them all. He had nothing but contempt for them, and yet he was still afraid of them. If some of them were supporters of this strange, silent Galilean, then they could turn very nasty when he condemned him to death. It was a tricky situation. Fortunately, he had an idea. There was a man under guard in the palace called Barabbas. He was a leader of the Dagger Men. The dagger men, in the eyes of the Romans, were notorious Jewish terrorists. Barabbas and his gang had caused a riot and had stabbed several Roman soldiers to death. Pilate was waiting to have them crucified after the festival, once the pilgrims had gone home. But perhaps he could let Barabbas off after all. Barabbas was a broken man. The Roman torturers had done their work well. He wouldn't cause any more trouble, and the rest of his gang would be executed anyway. Pilate knew he wouldn't be taking any real risk if he released him. But the crowd wouldn't know that, of course. They'd like it if Barabbas was set free. He often released one of his prisoners at Passover to keep the crowds happy. They'd come to expect it. This time, he could give them a choice: Barabbas or Jesus. They'd choose the one they liked best, only he and the priests would see to it they got Barabbas. Yes, Pilate thought to himself, this could work out very nicely. He gave orders for Barabbas to be fetched from the dungeons. Then he went over to the priests and explained his plan. The priests left the room and went outside to mingle with the crowd. There was a large platform out in the courtyard, and in the middle of it a grand seat like a throne. Some soldiers escorted Pilate to the platform, and he sat down. More soldiers came behind him, leading Jesus and Barabbas. "As you see," Pilate called out, pointing to Jesus, "I've got your precious king. Would you like me to set him free for you?" "No, Barabbas!" the crowd shouted. Those priests have done a good job, thought Pilate. "Then what shall I do with this king?" he said to the crowd. "Crucify him!" they yelled. "Why?" Pilate said, pretending to be horrified. "What's he done wrong?" The crowd yelled all the louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" "My word," said Pilate to himself, "those priests are clever. Crucifixion's a Roman punishment. Getting Jews to call for a Jew to be crucified. Who ever heard of such a thing? The priests have got them completely hysterical." "Very well," he said to the crowd, "I'll do as you say." He turned to the soldiers. "Let Barabbas go. As for this Jesus, give him a good flogging and then crucify him." He got down from the platform and went inside the palace to get on with his work. It had all gone remarkably smoothly, he thought. The soldiers took the flogging very seriously. They knew just how far to go. Too many strokes of the whip and you could kill a man. Then you'd have no one to crucify. You had to get it just right, nearly knock the life out of him, but not quite. When they'd finished, they took Jesus indoors to the part of the palace where the rest of the soldiers were gathered. "Look what we've got," they called out. "We've got the King of the Jews, we have." The others gathered round. "Doesn't look much like a king, does he?" one of them said. "We'll have to dress him up," said another. "Come here, your majesty. We can do better than King of the Jews. We'll make you look like the emperor himself." "The emperor wears purple, so let's put this lovely purple cloak on you," they cried. "And the emperor wears a laurel wreath too. Oh, what a pity, your majesty. We don't have any laurel, but we do have this nice crown of thorns. You'll have to have this instead. Let's put it on for you. This is your coronation, your majesty." They jammed the crown of thorns onto Jesus' head and knelt in front of him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they shouted. They struck him about the head with a cane and spat in his face. The room was filled with their laughter. Finally, they'd had enough. They took the cloak off him, dressed him again in his peasant clothes, and led him out to crucify him. An officer called a centurion was in charge of the execution party. The soldiers hung a tablet around Jesus' neck. It had the words, "The King of the Jews," on it. Pilate wanted everyone to see what happened to people who dared challenge Roman power. Jesus had to carry his own cross, or at least its horizontal beam, into the place of execution. It was heavy and difficult to maneuver through the narrow streets. He'd had too much of a beating. The torture had left him very weak, and his legs were like jelly. He collapsed on the ground, the beam of the cross falling on top of him. "Get up!" The centurion shouted and kicked him hard. It was no good. The strength wasn't in him. A Jew called Simon from the city of Cyrene on the North African coast happened to be passing by. "Hey, you," the centurion called. "Come and carry this man's cross. We've a job of work to do and we want to get it done before next week." So the little procession wound its way once more through the streets of Jerusalem, some of the soldiers in front, some at the rear, with Jesus in the middle and Simon lugging the cross along behind. They came to a place outside the city walls called Golgotha, or the place of the skull. Some women offered Jesus some drugged wine to dull the pain, but he wouldn't take it. Then the soldiers stripped him naked and crucified him. They fixed a 2-meter piece of wood upright in the ground, nailed Jesus' wrists to the beam that Simon had been carrying, hauled him up with ropes, tied and nailed the 2 parts of the cross together, and nailed Jesus' feet to the vertical piece. Finally, they fixed the tablet with "The King of the Jews" on it, just above his head. So now, at last, the king-making ceremonies were complete. Jesus was set on a cross for all to see. The cross was his throne. "Father God, forgive them," Jesus said, panting hard for breath. "They don't know what they're doing." The soldiers divided his clothes among them, casting lots to see which piece each of them should have. 2 bandits were crucified with Jesus, one on his left and one on his right. It was a noisy place. People had come to see the execution, and they started yelling abuse at Jesus. Even the chief priests had come, and some of the scribes were there. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself." "Come on, Messiah," they all shouted. "Get down from the cross and we'll all believe you then." One of the bandits joined in the mockery. "You can save us at the same time," he shouted. "You're a fine one to talk," the other bandit cried. "This is your last chance to do something right. We know why we're here, but this man has done nothing wrong, and he is a king. I know it." He looked across at Jesus. "Jesus," he said, "remember me when you come into your kingdom." "I tell you, my friend," Jesus replied, "this very day you will be with me in paradise." 3 hours passed. It was noon. It was meant to be the brightest part of the day, but suddenly the sun disappeared and a thick darkness fell over the whole land. It was as if the sun had turned to ashes, as if the whole of creation was in mourning. The darkness lasted for 3 more hours. The desolation was complete. Most of Jesus' friends had deserted him. Even God had abandoned him. At least that's what it seemed like. Those mock trials before the temple authorities and Pilate, the brutality of the temple guards and the Roman soldiers, the fearful pain, the continual fighting for breath, and now this strange, terrifying darkness all seemed to have shut God out. He was nowhere to be seen, nowhere to be heard. Words of an ancient psalm filled Jesus' mind. He raised his head and yelled them into the dark. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why? And then with one last great gasp, he died. At that very moment, in the temple inside the city, the great curtain separating the innermost room, the Holy of Holies, from the rest of the sanctuary, split from top to bottom. Jesus' death had brought God out into the open. They couldn't keep him hidden away anymore. They couldn't pretend that only high priests were good enough to enter his presence. Just when Jesus felt most abandoned by him, God came out to walk the streets of the city as once he had walked the paths of the Garden of Eden. In that darkness beneath Jesus' cross, it had seemed almost as if God himself had died. And in truth, God's death had set God free. The centurion at the foot of the cross sensed the meaning of it all. He looked up at Jesus. "This man was God's son," he cried. Now the execution was complete. The few friends of Jesus in the crowd crept closer. 3 women who were there, who'd followed him in Galilee and who'd travelled to Jerusalem with him. Among them was Mary of Magdala. There was also one member of the Jewish Sanhedrin who hadn't agreed with what they'd done to Jesus. His name was Joseph, and he came from a town called Arimathea. He'd kept quiet long enough. He plucked up his courage and went to Pilate to ask if he could have Jesus' body for burial. The Romans usually left the bodies of crucified men hanging there. Joseph couldn't bear to think of Jesus' body just left to rot or picked over by vultures. Pilate had had enough of Jesus. "Do with him what you like," he said. So Joseph ran off, bought a new linen shroud in the market, and went as quickly as he could with some of his friends to Golgotha. He took Jesus' body down, wrapped it in the sheet, and carried it to a tomb which had been cut out of the rock, the kind they could walk into if they bent their heads down. Joseph had meant to be buried there himself one day, but no matter. They laid Jesus' body inside and rolled a huge stone across the entrance. Then they hurried away. Jesus' devoted follower, Mary of Magdala, had followed the little burial procession, keeping her distance so she wouldn't be noticed. She had seen that Joseph and his friends hadn't had time to give Jesus a proper burial. They hadn't washed his body or anointed it with sweet-smelling oils. The next day was the Sabbath, and Mary wouldn't be able to do anything then. But as soon as dawn broke on the day after that, she would come back to the tomb and set things to rights. How she would move the stone, she didn't know. But she would deal with that problem when she came to it. She walked away, wondering when the tears would come and she would be able to let out her grief. Mary got up very early on the Sunday morning and went off to the tomb. She hadn't been able to wait for the dawn. It was still dark, but there was enough light to show her when she got to the tomb that something very strange had happened. The stone was rolled back from the entrance, and someone had removed Jesus' body. She knew the house where Peter was hiding with Jesus' other friends. She ran there as fast as she could. "They've taken Jesus out of the tomb," she cried. "I don't know where they've put him. Who would do such a thing?" The tomb was in a garden. Mary told them exactly where it was, and Peter and one of the others went running off to see what had happened. Mary followed them as quickly as she could. Peter's companion got there first. Mary was right. The stone which must have sealed the entrance had been moved aside. The sun had just risen above the horizon, and its first rays shone into the tomb, turning its stone to gold. He looked inside. The tomb was empty except for the linen shroud Joseph had used, lying on the ledge where the body had been placed. Only the body wasn't there. No smell of death either. At that moment, Peter came running up and went straight inside. He also saw the shroud and the cloth which Joseph must have tied around Jesus' head, but Jesus wasn't there. His companion bent his head and came in. He didn't fully understand, but he knew something very good had happened in that place. The tomb wasn't empty at all. It was full of the life of God. The 2 men went home bewildered, not knowing what to make of it. Yet Mary didn't leave. She had reached the tomb again, and she didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't leave. She hadn't deserted Jesus when he was crucified, and she wouldn't desert him now. She stood outside the tomb, weeping. Suddenly, she caught the scent and the rustle of heaven. She bent down to look inside the tomb. There were 2 angels sitting on the ledge, as bold as brass, as if they belonged there. What was heaven doing in this garden? It wasn't the time for heaven. It was the time for tears, and plenty of them. "Why are you crying?" the angels asked. "Why do you think?" Mary answered. "They've taken away my Lord, my friend, my teacher, and I don't know where they've laid him." She straightened herself. A lot of use they were, she said to herself, call themselves angels. She turned around. A figure was standing there. It was Jesus. "Why are you crying?" the figure said. "Who are you looking for?" Mary thought he must be the gardener. "Oh, sir," she cried, "if you have taken him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I'll go and fetch him." "Mary," the figure said. Now she recognized the voice. It was Jesus. "Teacher," she cried. She took a step forward. "You can't hold on to me, Mary," said Jesus quietly. "I am free now. But go to the rest of my friends and tell them what you've seen and heard, and tell them I will be with God soon." Then he was gone, and the angels with him. Mary went running off to tell the others. She burst in upon them and exclaimed, "I have seen the Lord. I have seen him."